the certified result in the presidential race in Florida is as follows. Governor George W. Bush, 2,912,790. Vice President Al Gore, 2,912,253. Accordingly, on behalf of the State Elections Canvassing Commission and in accordance with the laws of the state of Florida, I hereby declare Governor George W. Bush the winner of Florida's 25 electoral votes for the President of the United States.
I think we all remember seeing those pictures of the vote recount, of the hanging, dimpled, pimpled, pregnant, swinging chads, and seeing all the different cases in the counties. But the interesting thing is, as bad as that was, as much as the entire nation was holding its breath and waiting to see what happened, as many lawsuits as there were, that was really just about one important state.
If we had had a national popular vote system in place, rather than having a chaotic, contentious recount in Florida, we would have had a contentious, chaotic recount in every state in the country.
Once you have more potential for recounts, you also have the potential for greater fraud. And so efforts on a national popular vote to encourage fraud would certainly be incentivized because it would potentially be more difficult to reveal the fraud on a national scale.
And the easiest place for fraud to be committed is in jurisdictions that are controlled by one party, because the other party isn't there to have poll watchers, to have poll workers, to basically have a system where the two parties are keeping an eagle eye on each other. And unfortunately, with the national popular vote system, it would be an incentive to commit fraud and try to change the outcome of elections.
You'd need tens of thousands of agents at each polling place. You could say, well, I live in Philadelphia. And you could go to Wilmington, Delaware and say, I live in Wilmington, Delaware. You couldn't have polls close at different times. You'd have to have them uniform as they do in Canada and in Europe because they don't want early voting in one part of the section of the country influencing another part of the section.
The 50 states have very different rules. Half of them require a driver's license to vote, half don't. Some have mail-in ballots and some don't. Some allow for early voting and others don't. Some go from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., others go from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., etc. We would have all kinds of equal protection problems because we'd have different rules.
You would have to figure out how are we going to run that election. And I think that means you would have to have a single national standard by which everybody votes. Now that may sound fairly attractive, why not? Until again you consider that this is a very large, enormous country with great geographic differences between different states, different demographics and so on. What makes sense for one state doesn't make sense for every other.
And then you would have to have much more control by the federal government. Control by the federal government, eliminating the involvement of the states. Now you would have accomplished exactly what the framers tried to avoid. You would put control in one place. And how are you going to stop the corruption there? Whichever party it is.
Without the Electoral College, the federal government would have to take more control over elections, which means that presidential appointees would wind up running presidential elections, right? Barack Obama's people would have been in charge of Barack Obama's re-election. Donald Trump's people would be in charge of Donald Trump's re-election, right? The Electoral College pushes that power out of Washington, D.C., down into the states. States run elections, states are in charge. It's distributed. No one state controls the outcome. Instead, it's up to 51 different jurisdictions to run that election.
There's a mechanism for what happens if it's too close to call in a particular state, not if it's too close to call across the country. This would create, quite simply, chaos. And it would throw any election like that, and I think that it would be far more common that you would have these sorts of elections, to the courts.
The stakes are enormously high. And so we would have litigation after such disputed elections, which would go on for months or even years. Meanwhile, the country would not have a president.
The president is essentially the foreign policy representative of the nation. And so if you have an ongoing problem and other countries rely upon our decisions in terms of making their own decisions, so delays on who will be making policy, the uncertainty of it, would be potentially disastrous in terms of how other nations respond to America's presence in the world. It would have ripple effects throughout the globe.
This will be catastrophic if we go months, let alone potentially years, with court battles. Who imagines today, with the divisions that we have in the United States, that either side is going to capitulate and just say, okay, you win, we'll lay down our swords, we'll stop fighting?
Imagine what happens in the stock market. Imagine what happens in the economy. What kind of a situation are we asking for? Well, direct popular election, while it sounds great, while it sounds very democratic, also carries within it the seeds of many problems that the founders rescued us from.
process. It's not a purpose.